So one of the main ideas besides the server-side rendering of Vue apps, which is basically the core thing Nuxt is able to do, is the fact that you can configure your entire Vue app and mainly the routing of your Vue app, so the pages you support, through folders and files. In a normal Vue app, you would have to define routes in a route config that looks something like this. You have a bunch of JavaScript objects in an array, and for each object you have a path property and a component which should be loaded. And you're passing this to Vue Router, the official routing package of Vue, and therefore you can then load these URLs. So your domain /nothing/products/products and then some dynamic products ID in this example. Now with Nuxt you can define or create the same structure and the same route config without routing such a config file. Instead you create a folder with a file inside of it, like for the root route, directly in the pages directory. That's important. That is where all your routing folders have to live. In the pages directory, you don't create a subfolder, but just add the index.vue file. The name does matter here. It has to be index. And this will then be your starting component for /nothing. For other paths, you would create subfolders with index files in there, or you could also create, for the second route here, you could also create a products.vue file, but I'll come back to that and when to choose which in a second. So you create a folder structure that reflects your URL structure. And basically, that is pretty straightforward to think about, because your URL can be seen as a path in a nested folder, and that's just what you're creating here. So let's see this navigation through folders and files in action. I created a brand new Nuxt project in exactly the same way with the same settings as in the first course module, so through Create Nuxt App. And I therefore have the same starting folder. I named this project Nuxt Course, but the name is totally up to you. I started the development server in the terminal integrated into my IDE, but it's the normal terminal or command prompt here. And I get this page on localhost 3000 therefore. Now, this pages folder is now what's responsible for that. I already mentioned this in the first course module. There we have the index.vue file, which holds the code we see on that page here. Now, as I said, the naming does matter. It has to be in the pages folder because that tells Nuxt, hey, these are my, pages of the app. And it has to be named index.vue because it's a Vue component. Nuxt builds up on Vue, so it uses Vue components. And index because just as we use an index.html file on a normal static web server, where then the web server also knows that it should load this file if you navigate to just /nothing, well, that's the same here. The index file is the default file to be loaded if you navigate to something. Now, as I showed you in the first course module, you can add a second file in the pages folder, which you could name users.vue. And in that file, you simply create a template with a simple output, the users view, for example. And this now all of a sudden adds this route to your route config. So behind the scenes, a route config like this will now have been created. You would have one route, which is path nothing, where you load the index.vue file, so the component in there. And you got a second path now, which would be /users, where you load the users.vue file. So the users component, essentially. So that is what was created behind the scenes, you could say. And that is why if we save everything, we can go back and we can reach that second route by first of all reloading the app to register the new config and then entering users. And we see the users view. Now, an alternative would have been to not create this users.vue file, but to create a users folder. So I created this new folder and move that users.vue file in there and name it index.vue. Now, the name is important because, as I just said, if you navigate to /some folder or /nothing, then the index.vue file will be rendered automatically. And with that setup, if you reload this /users page here, you see it still works and it works exactly the same way as before. Now, what is the difference then? Which approach should you use? Well, if you use the folder approach as I use it here, in my opinion, it becomes a bit easier to read because you now really have a folder structure, just as you can think of your URL as a folder structure. We're in the /users folder, and then we can go into the user folder for the ID1 and so on. So that is why I would recommend using that folder-driven approach with index.view files, but technically it's also registered as a new route if you create a file named differently than index.view, then this file name will be the path you can navigate to. This is the core concept of Pages. You create folders or files, and with that you create a route config behind the scenes. Now, of course, we can do a bit more, and for example, we can also load dynamic parameters, like here in the example I just mentioned. Let's say we want to go to /1, so to pick the user with the ID 1. Obviously that's dynamic, and we don't want to create a bunch of subfolders here, 1, 2, 3, because we couldn't even do that as a developer, because we don't know which users our app will have in the end. So dynamic parameters is also supported, and we can even nest these. So a bunch of exciting things we can do. Let's take a look at these things in the next lecture.